topic today is a very challenging one. Throughout Tisha B'Av, we relive the calamities. Every Jew is in a state of, on the one hand, Avelis and Shiva. On the other hand, Misha Mesa Muta Lefanav. The dead, the tragedies are happening in front of us. The kinos that we say, those are the eulogies, those are the hespedim, as we relive, whether you have parents, don't have parents, whether someone has been in Avel or not, every one of us is in Shiva on Tisha B'Av. And it's not just the tragedies. Those who died al Kiddush Hashem, the Churban Beis HaMikdash, the annihilation of German Jewry in 1096, the events throughout the millennia. But there's something else that we mourn. And that is the terrible Chilul Hashem, the terrible desecration of God's name with the attack on Judaism, the attack on the Torah SheBaal Peh, on everything that we cherish in our Masorah. And that is what we're talking about today, particularly the 41st Kinah. It was written by the famous Maharam of Rothenburg, of Mayor of Rothenburg. At the time, he was 25 years old at the time of the tragedy we're going to discuss. And then when the Kinah was written, with the destruction of all the texts within France, of all the texts, the Kisvei Kodesh, of the Talmud, of the Mishnah, of the Medrash, everything destroyed 2 years later in 1242 when he was 27 years old. And he writes Shali Srufa Ba'esh. That event, as we'll see, is the death, not the funeral, but it's the death of French Jewry. It's the death of 150 years of maybe one of the most important 150-year periods, the period of the Balei Tosfos, when the Masorah that had traveled from Israel to Bavel, that had migrated into the German Rhineland, then was destroyed in 1096, reestablished itself through Rabbeinu Tam, Rashi's grandson, through the Rashbam, Rashi's grandson, through Rashi's great-grandson, the Ri of Dampierre, and all the schools in Evreux and Paris. And all of that is put to an end in the event that we're going to discuss. Let's take a step back. We mentioned that Ashkenaz had transplanted itself from the German Rhineland into France, into northern France. Remember, there's no such thing as Germany or France in medieval times. Tsarfas, under King Louis IX, which, by the way, he was, for the event that we're going to be speaking about, he was turned into a saint, and many of you know the famous city, St. Louis. Many places have been named across the globe in memory of this Russia. Well, he controls northern France, what in Hebrew we call Tsarfat, okay? Provence, Languedoc, southern France, the French Riviera, that's a different territory. But these Jewish communities in Paris, in Paris, in Evreux, in Dampierre, in Orléans, northeastern through northwestern France is controlled. And the Jews had been flourishing there. We were rebuilding Ashkenazic Jewry, and in the period of the Balei Tosfos, people from all over the world came to study with these great mentors. What happened? 32 years earlier, in 1208, there was an attack on Aristotle. The screen just went black. There was an attack on Aristotle, and all of the books of Aristotle in the universities everywhere burnt, destroyed. 1232, not in northern France, but in Provence, there was an attack against the Rambam's Moreh Nevuchim, his philosophical guide that articulated Jewish principles in a language, in a context of Neoplatonic and Neo-Aristotelian thought that people could appreciate, especially Jews living in the Arabic lands and the Muslim lands. Because in Islam at that time, there was a tremendous influence, Averroes, Al-Farabi, who were influenced by Neo-Aristotelian thought, Neoplatonic thought. And Islam was dealing with these issues. How to explain their theology in a context of rationality and chokhmah and wisdom. And the Rambam was addressing the Jews who were grappling with these issues. The Rambam as well, in the famous Hilchos Yesodei HaTorah, the beginning of the Mishnah Torah, addressed these issues. And in Provence, when the words of the Rambam reach there, and when they have, through the Ibn Tibbon family, his Judeo-Arabic works, his commentary to the Mishnah, which includes his commentary to the introduction of the 10th chapter of Sanhedrin that deals with Jewish philosophy, the Moreh Nevuchim, the Guide to the Perplexed, it's translated into Hebrew. The Jews in southern France, in Provence, in Languedoc, they eat this up. They're fascinated by the works of the Rambam. And at the same time, many Jews are threatened by the works of the Rambam. And there are major battles, intellectual battles amongst great Jews, the Yad Ramah, Rabbi Meir Abulafia, Rabbeinu Yonah of Gerona, others who are combatants who disagree with the Rambam's principles. But the tumult, the fight amongst the masses becomes very ugly. So that the anti-Rambam camp, the anti-Maimonidean camp, they bring in the Dominican Friars. In the Dominican Friars, they show the works of the Rambam. They show the sections from Hilchos Malachim that are anti-Christological. These Dominican Friars, they convey and they collect all the manuscripts of the Rambam and burn them. There's a burning of the Rambam in 1232. In this, the catalyst for this was Jew against Jew. It was Jews who were the catalyst who brought in the Dominican Friars. Who are the Dominican Friars? In medieval Europe, not just in the 12th century, but before and after, the Vatican, the church, controls everything. Yes, there are feudal lords. Yes, there are governments. But those governments are under the influence of the church. And the Dominican and the Frederican friars have terrible, terrible sway over governments. Now, St. Louis IX, who wants to ingratiate himself to the Pope at the time, Pope Gregory IX, when these Dominican friars, who are they're licking their chops. They've gotten a taste of destroying Judaism, of destroying Torah SheBaal Peh through the works of the Rambam. They attack all of Judaism. The very Jews who were the catalyst for the anti-Rambam works now become the object of the scorn, the wrath, the fury of the Dominican friars. And there's a terrible Jew who goes shmad, who becomes a Dominican friar, who he converts, a self-hating Jew by the name of Nicholas Donin. And he becomes the accuser. And at the behest of Pope Gregory IX, Louis IX demands a vikuach, a disputation. We're going to put the Talmud on trial. Who's chosen to defend the Talmud? They chose the great head of the yeshiva in Paris, Rabbi Yechiel of Paris. Rabbi Yechiel was such an outstanding Talmud Chacham that people like Mayor of Rothenburg from Germany and others they migrated to Paris to learn in this yeshiva. And Rabbi Yechiel of Paris leads a group that defends the Talmud, that defends our theology in a scenario where the prosecutor, the judge, and the jury are all the Dominican friars. It's a foregone conclusion before the debate ever happens. What's the attack? First and foremost, the Talmud is anti-Christological. And many of you are familiar because today we have access to the Vatican archives. There are very few manuscripts that survived medieval Europe. The famous München document, the Gemara, the Munich Ksav Yad. It has those Christological references. They're not particularly complementary in any way, shape, or form. Mary Magdalene, who is the female role model, the female mentor to all Christian women. What the Talmud says about who she was. How did she get the name Magdalene? Megadol Seir. She was a hairdresser who happened to engage in improprieties with Roman soldiers. It's very critical. It's very harsh. And it's called a blasphemous, attacking, vile, disgusting document on those accounts. The Agaditas. You and I know the methodology of the Agadita. You take abstract conceptual ideas and you concretize them. You concretize them in a very tangible, concrete mashal, analogy, or story. Now, if you take the story literally, it looks silly, it looks ridiculous. But anyone who knows the derech of the Torah SheBaal Peh, the methodology, knows what? Those ideas are meant to do what? Those ideas are meant to take very difficult, abstract ideas and hook you emotionally and get you thinking and get you analyzing. And they're the most difficult Gemaras we have, are those Agadah. But if you take them literally, it looks like silly stories. And he attacked the Talmud. And the Medrash is being nonsensical. Jews are fools. The reason they have such a sick religion and they don't see the truth and accept our Lord is because they're being told rubbish and nonsense and stories. And it was also attacked as being a discriminating, racist type of document. Meaning what? There are many categories of halacha where someone who's a member of the covenant is entitled to certain benefits, someone who's not, isn't. God forbid, never anywhere in the Talmud is there anything discriminatory against a non-Jew. Every human being is B'Tselem Elokim. But there are certain benefits the Jew has being a member of the family. Priorities in charity. Prohibition against usury, rivas. If it was your mother, if it was your brother, you're not going to charge your mother or brother interest. That's your family. A stranger, you charge interest. And interest is not immoral. For the same reason you can charge rent when you rent an apartment, when you rent an automobile, when you rent a piece of equipment. You have a right. There's what's called the opportunity cost. You have every right. It's totally moral to charge interest, which is why a Gentile can charge a Jew interest and a Jew can charge a Gentile interest. But for family, the Torah is inculcating us the mentality that you treat your fellow Jew not as a stranger. They're not an other. They're your brother, achicha. But they took and they twisted that. And there are a number of Gemaras that allude to something known as the minim. What is a min? Literally, a min is a heretic. But the min is not a generic heretic. It's referring to the Judeo-Christians. It's referring to some of the things that the Apostle Paul, Shaul of Tarshish, said, that other church fathers said, Justin Martyr, others. And it's very critical of that theology. So the Talmud was put on trial. And as we said, it was a foregone conclusion. That took place in the year 1240. And it was condemned to be burnt. And it took them 2 years. They went from Jewish community to Jewish community throughout every village, every town, and every city in France. And they seized all manuscripts. There were no printing press. This is pre the printing press. Think about how much time it took to write one Amud of Gemara, one Amud, with the Gemara, the Rashi, the Bali Tosfos on the side. Think about how long it would take you and I if we were a scribe to write one Amud. Can you imagine what it took to write a whole Masechta? Can you imagine what it took to write a whole Shas? There were very few manuscripts. And every one of them is precious. Again, we're talking before the printing press, which is probably technologically the greatest invention in the sense that it changed the way the world works more than any other invention in history. That which changed humanity was the printing press. Actually, Gutenberg's changeable type. Now, once they burn in Le Place de Grave, it's not far from Notre Dame, they took 24 cartloads. It was Parshas Chukas, I believe it was the 20th of Sivan. Parshas Chukas, it was a Friday. Burnt them all. And it was a public showing, a public demonstration. With no Torah SheBaal Peh, with no Svarim, with no commentaries, no Rashi, no Rabbeinu Gershom. What did the Jews do? We're an orphaned people. Look at American Jewry. With 50 years of no Jewish education for the majority of American Jews, or minimal Jewish education for the majority of American Jews, today we're looking at close to 65% intermarriage rate. If you pull the Orthodox out, we're looking at way over 70% intermarriage rate. We know what happens when there is no Jewish education. Okay? We know what happens. And French Jewry couldn't remain. Rabbi Yechiel of Paris himself, he took a number of his students, and they traveled across the Mediterranean, and they came to Akko. Many of you have been to the famous Crusader fortress in Akko. And the Christians there let them have a yeshiva. They lived with the Christians in the Crusader fortress. But he was forced to leave Paris. And most French Jews left. The expulsion of Jews from France didn't take place in 1242. It took place a couple of decades later. That was the funeral. The death was 1242 with the burning of all texts, with all manuscripts, in the Place de Grave in Paris. Most of these Jews moved north, back into Germany, which was the seat of Ashkenaz and Mainz and Worms before the First Crusade, before 1096. That's where most went. And they started to repopulate Germany. Mayor of Rothenburg, we said was 27 years old when he wrote the 41st Kinah, when he wrote Sha'ali Sarufa Ba'esh. Mayor of Rothenburg goes back to Germany and he rebuilds the Masorah. The Masorah that had been transplanted from Germany into France is now reverts back to the German Rhineland. He's buried in Worms. Many of you can go to visit his kever. He had many great students. 3 that impacted all of the Jewish world. The most famous 3 that we know, Rabbeinu Asher, the Mordechai, his great student, who shaped the positions of the Ramah, who shaped all of Ashkenaz. The Mordechai was murdered with his wife and children in the Rindfleisch massacres. He was the chief rabbi of Nuremberg Jewry, and he was murdered. I apologize, I forgot his name, but we know him as the Hagos Maimoni. In the Rambam's Mishnah Torah, underneath the Rambam, you have the Kesef Mishnah, the Lechem Mishnah. What do you have there? Hagos Maimoni. What did he do? On all the positions of the Rambam, he would quote what the great Chachmei Ashkenaz, what their positions are. His Rebbe, Rav Meir of Rothenburg, Rabbeinu Tam, the Rabbeinu Tam's great student, the Rash Mishans, right? Shimshon of Shons. He actually was the first to leave France and to settle in Israel. His famous commentary on the Mishnayos. It's his students who are the editors of our Bali Tosfos that we have, Tosfos Evarot, Tosfos Tuch. The Rosh, Rabbeinu Asher, who was involved in trying to raise, and they did raise money to redeem their Rebbe, Rav Meir of Rothenburg. He was the leader of German Jewry. And the feudal lord in that area of the German Rhineland abducted him and held him ransom. And the Jewish community raised a fortune of money, and he prohibited them. Absolutely not. He prohibited them from redeeming him. He says, if this happens with me, doesn't matter who I am, this is just the beginning. They're going to do the next one, and the prices will go up, and it will destroy our community. You may not redeem me. And he lived, Rav Meir of Rothenburg, the last years of his life, in the fortress, in the Migdal, in incarceration, and many of the tshuvos of Rabbeinu Asher, and many of the tshuvos of the Maharam of Rothenburg that his students wrote after they communicated with him, many of them were written in incarceration. Rabbeinu Asher speaks in the Shelos HaTshuvos Harash about how he would go to visit him. But Meir of Rothenburg took upon himself the responsibility of rebuilding the Masorah and continuing the Masorah in Germany, where it lasted till after the Black Death, when eventually the whole Masorah of Ashkenaz then starts moving east into Galicia, further east into Poland, further east into Lita, into Eastern Poland, White Russia, the Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia. But that's later in history. After France, most Jews moved north to Germany. Some moved into Spain. They crossed the Pyrenees and they went into northern Spain. It's an oxymoron, but all of us know Sephardic Jews with the last name Tsarfati. How can you be a Spanish Jew, a Sephardic Jew with the last name Frenchman? Huh? How can you do that? The way you do that is what? Is because these were French Jews after the burning of the Talmud that settled there. Some went to northern Italy, and they established communities throughout northern Italy, and then eventually into southern Italy. But most went back to Germany. But what this did was, this vikuach set the tone for hatred and animosity and a war, because Nicholas Donin opened things up, that the church, they view the Talmud, they view the Medrash as a closed book. They have the Bible because they have the translation into Greek and Septuagint. They have the translation from the Greek into Latin, the Vulgate. Okay? So they're studying in Latin the Vulgate. But the Talmud and the Medrash was a closed book. And they could never get anywhere with Jews because the Jews looked at them as like, you're corrupting, you don't even have the right translation of the Bible, of the Tanakh. And then with your corrupt translation, you pervert it. You don't understand that the Tanakh is the shorthand notes of a whole theology, of the axioms, of the postulates, of everything that we value, what we call the Torah SheBaal Peh, which has its own methodology. Well, Nicholas Donin, the former Jew, the self-hating Jew, what does Nicholas Donin do? He, quote unquote, exposes the Talmud. From that point on in history, Jews self-censored the Talmud. I'll give you a simple example. In Brachos Daf Yud Aleph, you have the Gemara that says our prayer service, our shacharis in the morning, had what? Psukei de Zimra, Baruch Hu, the Birkas Kriya Shema, and then in the middle of Birkas Kriya Shema, you had two things. You had Shema and the Aseres HaDibros. Every Jew said the Aseres HaDibros. But that was, the Gemara says, Kfar Bitlum. It was nullified. They took it out of davening. They took it out of the Siddur. They took it out of Shacharis and Mariv. Says, why? Mipnei taromas ha'akum. Because of the provocations of the primitive pagans, of the star worshippers. What does that mean? Well, we have the manuscripts from the Vatican. We have manuscripts, the Munich document. It's mipnei taromas haminim. It's the Shaul of Tarshish, the Apostle Paul, that says that after Jesus, after the carpenter of Nazareth, there's been a, God forbid, there's going to be a revocation. There's going to been a rejection of what? There's been a break of the covenant. There's a filthy word that no Jew should ever say, Old Testament. That's the Old Testament. Before that covenant was revoked. Now there's a New Testament. There's a new covenant. Chas v'shalom. You're only bound by that what God told us. Everything else is man-made. Since Jesus is a successor to Moses and surpasses Moses, you only have to follow what God said, the 10 Commandments. That's it. And you and I know it's 14 commandments, but they call it the 10 Commandments, okay? So what happened? I apologize about the bell. So what happened? What happened was, we have the documents. We've been to the Vatican. It was mipnei taromas haminim, because of the provocations of the Judeo-Christians. They said, look, the Jews themselves admit this is the only thing from God. Everything else is man-made. They admit it themselves. Because what do? They put it in the heart of their prayer service. And they say it as the way we say dogma, the way we say the catechism. They say their catechism, the 10 Commandments. That, okay, is one example. And if you look at Rashi there, what's Haminim? We don't have it in our Rashi. Talmidei Yeshu HaNotzri, the students of Jesus of Nazareth. There are many Gemaras like that we self-censored. Think about Aleinu. We took out Shehem, the verse from Yeshaya Hanavi. Shehem mishtachavim lehevel varik. They prostrate to that which is nonsense and nothing. Umispalalim el, they pray to a God, lo Yoshia, who will not grant them salvation. They assumed we were talking about Yeshu. They assumed that we were knocking Christianity. We took it out. We changed the text, the bracha of the Haftorah, the bracha achrona. We changed the bracha v'lamishumadim al tikva v'laminim kareget toved. We changed it. We say malshinim. All of these Gemaras we changed to Akum. And we self-censored all the Christological references, all the references to Mary Magdalene, took it all out. Because we did not want to suffer what we suffered at the hands of the Judeo-Christians. That is the story and the aftermath of this tragedy. And this was the beginning. Is it possible to get the door? This was the beginning of what? Of a tragedy. Of a tragedy that's gone on now, not so much in Christian Europe, but that has gone throughout Islamic world. The attack, guys, I'm recording. The attack against what? The attack against the Torah SheBaal Peh, against our theology. The Chil Shem Shamayim, the desecration of God's name, the desecration of everything we cherish and we treasure as holy. There's an attack against it. It's taking Judaism and turning it into a gutter religion. It's taking Judaism and turning it into a racist, vile source of evil. That's what started in 1240 with Nicholas Donin, with the Dominican Friars, with King Louis IX, with Pope Gregory IX. And that tragedy, unfortunately, has repeated itself multiple times. You go to Rome, you go to Venice where there were burnings of the Talmud during post-Renaissance, and you see it today. You go to the White Aryan Nation's website and see how they quote the Talmud out of context. You go to Islamic documents. You listen to the clerics of the Shia and the Sunni. This is all a repetition of that which started and that which we mourn on Tisha B'Av in Sha'ali Srufa Ba'esh. And do you know how many Jewish communities have been overturned by this? How many Jews have not only been attacked and killed by this, but how many Jews have been lost? Because when every time there's an upheaval in a Jewish world, you can't just turn around and restart it in 6 months. It takes generations and decades. That is the story of Sha'ali Srufa Ba'esh in the 41st Kinah. And that is the attack against our Masorah and the Torah SheBaal Peh. I want to wish everyone, please God, if we go through Tisha B'Av, it should be a cathartic, transformative, meaningful Tisha B'Av. And ultimately, the transformation that we experience should lead to our tshuva, which ultimately will lead to the transformation of the Jewish nation and the Geula. If not, the black screen went. And if not, if we're not Zocha to Tisha B'Av, then I'll see you in Yerushalayim. Thank you.